Thanks so much for joining us, gentlemen. Let's jump right into it and talk about the pandemic. Well, how would you, and let's start with you, Darrell, how would you assess Trump's handling of the pandemic and Congress's handling of the pandemic, and how would you have done things differently if you were in office now?
Well, I certainly think that initially it was a good, sequentially correct effort. The president shutting down the source being coming in from China early was a good decision. No question at all, we would have liked him to have recognized that the transit into New York from Italy was every bit as volatile, and it took longer to recognize that and shut down what it was essentially another direction, the one that had so much effect on New York City. Initially, Congress came together, and whether we think they did it right or wrong, they did it quickly and on a bipartisan basis, and it enabled the administration to have the dollars to, quite frankly, to stem what would have been a panic. I think that's where the good deeds end. I think after that, this has been a textbook place where we're going to learn in the future that different cities and different states having different rules and shifting, our healthcare know-it-alls being wrong about masks initially and then flipping around with a vengeance and pretending that they didn't say the opposite early. All of those things, I think, are lessons to be learned. The other lesson to be learned is the American people want to be told the truth, and they want to have some level of consistency. And I think we haven't had that, and that continues to be a problem with trust by people who are being asked to make huge sacrifices.
Ammar?
Yeah, a lot of people have made a lot of sacrifices due to the COVID response. Obviously, I think it's very evident that this pandemic, I don't think anything could have full stop stopped it, but there were some things we could have done initially to be more proactive. The previous administration did create a rapid response team with the CDC, and we did have textbook best practices based on prior pandemics that we could have implemented that I think this administration disregarded in the early stages when we could have really stemmed the tide the most. And we removed some of our officials in China who could have detected this early on. There were people in the administration who called it a hoax, and others as well. And I think that made some people not think that this was going to be a serious issue until it was too late. And unfortunately, a member of my family, my Tío Ruben, passed away from COVID-19. And obviously it's a huge public health issue, but it's also an economic issue. My family also struggled to pay for the funeral. And we also couldn't all be there to have a proper burial because of the social distancing. So it was a huge, huge heartbreak for us financially and health-wise and everything else that happened with my Tío Ruben. And he had pre-existing conditions, but obviously this is the thing that made the difference. And so it's personal for me and my family, and for many families in this district and throughout the country, as we reach over 100,000 deaths from COVID-19. So I think the response from the administration left a lot to be imagined, to put it mildly. Congress did work in a bipartisan fashion quickly to get things done. I would have liked to see more bipartisanship earlier. I think there was a little bit of red meat trying to be thrown in both directions. And I think the way that the administration of the PPP loans were not done in the best way possible. But given the circumstances, I do think Congress did step up and do the best they could. If I was there right now, I'd try to make sure we get more stimulus going to small businesses. For every dollar that you spend keeping a small business open and requiring them to pay their employees, that's one less dollar you need in unemployment. So I would approach two things: save the business, save the worker, invest in the PPP loans, make sure it goes to small businesses and not these major corporations like Ruth Chris and Jamba Juice and others who don't really need it, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you specifically about your reaction. When do you both wear masks when you go out? Ammar, you first.
Yeah, I wear it.
Under what circumstances?
I wear it almost all the time. If I'm speaking and I'm far away from folks, I'll take it off momentarily, but I wear it almost all the time. I wear it when I'm not in my pod or with my immediate family that I've been quarantining with. But outside of that, I usually wear it all the time.
Pretty much the same thing. You know, I don't wear it in the car driving down the road. I do wear it compliant with all the rules. You know, and generally, as Ammar said, you know, when I'm doing live events, you know, if I've got to be fairly close, or if I'm in an airplane, of course, I'm going to be wearing it all the time. If I can get 12 feet of separation, including for an interview like this, if it's not Zoom, obviously it's a good time to take it off so I can be heard. But I think, you know, and I think that's been something that we now understand the rules, and I think we're seeing generally good compliance. You know, I have my concerns about events that people seem to want to talk about not doing it, and you know, I make it a point to wear mine coming in, wear mine going out, and maintain the distance if I don't have it on.
I'm sure you saw the news reports today of Sturgis. There's a report out that it cost, I think, $12 billion there was a cost to the economy because a lot of people showed up at that rally without wearing masks. Let me ask you about another high profile example of people not wearing masks, the president's speech at his convention. If you were there, would you have been wearing a mask? Darrell, you first.
You know, that's a good question. From what I could see, people had an opportunity, and many people took advantage of an opportunity to maintain sufficient distancing at that outdoor event. You know, certainly the fact that it was outdoors, you know, gives you a perceived different arithmetic. You know, there's no question at all that you know, that was one of those times in which I'm sure not everybody kept their distances. As a matter of fact, and I'm not trying to be partisan, but I want to be accurate, the people who harassed people when they were leaving, for the most part, didn't have their mask on or weren't properly maintaining distance. So, you know, certainly we see examples time and time again. And it's a concern that that some people don't take it seriously, others flaunt it, and you see that on television. It's been widely covered. I can only speak for myself. I saw people at the at the acceptance speech who were wearing masks because they were sitting within a few feet of somebody else, and they did what I thought was appropriate and I would have done.
Ammar, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with this. I agree in terms of wearing the mask when appropriate. And look, I think it's really important we don't moralize the way that we should respond to COVID-19. I think it's really important that we follow the science and the data and listen to the scientists and not say you're a bad person if you don't wear one in certain places and you're a good person if you do. For example, when beaches were allowed to be reopened in San Diego, people were saying, how dare you go to beaches? And the best science and data told us that that's actually one of the safest things you could do right now is go to the beach and be socially distant rather than be inside a gymnasium where there's an accumulated risk of people breathing and not as good ventilation as being outdoors by the beach. The same thing is true for, you know, the permits that we gave locally, waiving the permits to allow people to do restaurants outdoors versus indoors. So it's really important that we don't just moralize this and say you're a good person or a bad person if you wear a mask here and don't wear a mask here. I think it's important that we let the science and the data lead us into when it's appropriate and when it's not. I'll give you an example. I was just at the fire yesterday helping some folks in Steel Canyon High School. I know we'll get to that later, but the moral of the story is there was a man who needed me to help him get some food, some hay for his horses. And I brought it to him and he refused to wear a mask. And I gave him one of my masks and I said, look, at the very least, wear it for your own protection from the smoke. And he finally took it and wore it. So not only am I encouraging myself to wear a mask, but I'm also encouraging those who might have some reluctance in doing it to protect myself and also to protect others. And I think that's what you have to do in this time, is be a little bit kind of gentle, but also assertive that this is about protecting the community, not just yourself.
Speaking of protecting the community, let me ask you both another personal question related to this about science and herd immunity. Once we get a vaccine or a treatment, would you be in the first group to take it? I mean, would you want to take it at that point, or would you have any reservations? Ammar, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I don't want special preference and treatment like we saw with some A-list celebrities.
And to be clear, I'm not asking about special treatment. I'm just asking about your whether you would want to take it.
Yeah, I'd be willing to do it.
I actually think that, you know, for people who hold themselves out to be leaders and role models, both of us would have to be proactive in willingness to take that, whatever the risk is, in order to get the public confidence that what the FDA had ruled as safe and effective was safe and effective. I think often that's the reason you do things like that. The same reason, you know, early on in this thing, I went out and gave blood because if you're doing it, you're setting an example where others feel comfortable doing it. And I had a mask on while I was giving blood.
Another specific issue that's come up related to the pandemic is voting. You both wrote op-eds for us about voting, and obviously, Darrell, at one point you had a lawsuit against the governor since recanted because the legislature made some moves. But the president has, you know, even recently telling people to vote twice, to vote once by mail, and then to go to the polls on election day and vote a second time. You know, what do you think of his approach and his comments and what he's saying about voting, seeming to, you know, call it into question? And how comfortable are both of you with vote by mail at this point? Darrell, what do you go first?
Yeah, I mean, when the governor thought that he could do this by executive order in conflict to the Constitution, we pointed out that it was in conflict to the Constitution. The legislature did what the Constitution says, which is that they can determine the time, place, and manner. They've now determined the time, place, and manner. So that's what made the litigation moot. But I think it's important that we, at this time or any time, hold the institutions to do what they're supposed to do. It wasn't that difficult to get the legislature to move a bill, and it was appropriate. And so now we have that part done and done properly. The reality is that I have a different interpretation. What I think I understood the president to say than what you may have, your question may have begged, Matt. And that is that my understanding is that he said, even if you've already voted, if you go to the polling place and see if your vote has been counted, that doesn't sound unreasonable to make sure that your ballot hasn't been lost. As you know, we have a procedure for provisional ballots where you say, hey, my ballot must have gotten lost in the mail, or I'm not sure. I'd like to put in a provisional ballot, and that would be consistent. It happens in every election. I would certainly reject anyone voting twice. I've seen that where people vote in 2 states and so on, and obviously it's wrong. Excuse me. So I think again, looking at California, we have a little bit of a problem this time because we will have 17 days after November 3rd in which ballots can still arrive. And so I think for Californians, you know, if you want to be certain, you should prepare your ballot and drop it off so that you know it's been received, and then check online to make sure that it's been counted at the appropriate time. But I don't think anyone's going to be able to show up on or before November 3rd and with any certainty know that their ballot will or won't arrive. It just isn't the way our system is. And I think for California, for our voters, they should just make a decision on where they turn their ballot in and how they turn it in, and then have confidence in the system, which is generally pretty reliable.
Ammar, what do you think about the system?
Yeah, I think it's generally pretty reliable too, and obviously not to relitigate our different positions on this in the op-eds. Those who want to could go on the Tribune, but I think one of the arguments also made by the congressman is that it was a new system, and it isn't for the 15 counties in California that have been using it under the Voters' Choice Act. It's also been done in Oregon for maybe 20, 30 years now in other states. So it's not a new system of the universal vote by mail. 80% of people this district do VBM, voting by mail, whether they turn it in person or vote by mail. So it's not a new system. I think the question of whether it was constitutional or not for the government to do it without legislation is one that could be heard. But, you know, he had a broad range of powers during a pandemic that allowed him to do things and gave him authorities that he could implement that are not typical of a regular time period. So that could be up for question, but obviously it was rendered moot fairly quickly. And I've talked to Michael Vu at the Registrar of Voters, asking him to make sure that there isn't fraud when it comes to these vote by mail ballots, how they go about purging deceased individuals who maybe are getting ballots sent to their homes and they're deceased, or if they've moved, et cetera. And from what he's told me, they do a pretty regular check on those kinds of issues, and it's pretty foolproof, especially in San Diego County. And then last but not least, I think it's important, while we talk about voting by mail for safety reasons, there are some people who just cannot vote by mail. And folks with disabilities who need in-person assistance, folks who live on tribal land or in rural areas who maybe don't have the best opportunity getting mail if it gets lost in the shuffle, or if you're somebody who either before COVID or even now, you're someone who moves around a lot and you don't have home security because you pay rent, you can't afford it, you move somewhere else. So voting in person becomes critical for you because your permanent address might be outdated on the file and you might have to go vote in person. So I think we should protect people's right to vote in person when needed, but also create the accommodations we need to allow everyone to vote by mail if they so choose to. And
Matt, if you don't mind, as you said, we'd be free flowing. I would say that anytime the federal Constitution, which very specifically says who has the right, and the legislature was not in some sort of hiatus, standing up for the Constitution, for the federal Constitution, which did not give the governor that authority, pandemic or no pandemic, I think it's important that we ask people to use what is constitutional. So, I stand very strongly behind the fact that pushing back on that, as many other pieces of litigation on behalf of liberty-loving Californians have occurred because of that pushback, is important. We have lots of times in our history in which leaders at the federal or local levels have decided that the Constitution is set aside if X happens. And we almost always look back in history and say that was a mistake. There would have been or should have been a way to deal with it. I think about World War II and wholesale incarceration of Americans because they were of Japanese ancestry. We look back and we go, wrong. It was wrong to do it. And constitutionally, it was dubious. And so, and that's one where the ACLU was on the right side of saying it was wrong. So I think anytime somebody says, I want a federal judge to look at something on constitutional grounds, that we should all at least support the idea that the day in court appropriately should be heard. And, I think we got a good outcome in this particular case. It's the only one that I engaged in or allowed my name to be used as one of the litigants. But I did so because the Constitution is very clear about who has that authority.
Before we move on to some other subjects, I want to see if any other board members have questions related to the pandemic.
The Defense Production Act has been used by America over and over and over and over and over and over to respond to national crises. Trump declined to use the Defense Production Act to do things like masks and ventilators, even after it was presented to him as an obvious thing to do in February. So I struggle with the idea that anyone would defend this president on the Defense Production Act alone. America is a wealthy country, yet for 3 months we had a shortage of masks. That's absurd, and it wouldn't have happened if the Defense Production Act had been invoked. So I welcome your guys' reaction to this and the preposterousness of America reacting to a national health crisis by not taking the most obvious basic step of all.
I'm happy to go first. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that the businesses would have been happy to take the business from wherever it came from, and they would have been happy to take the dollars and invest in those PPEs and the ventilations and everything else. So I agree with you 100%. We did it during World War II with Ford. They created bombers 1 an hour. And our manufacturing capabilities are not where they need to be and should be. So we have to reevaluate that aspect too. The president's willingness to use that act, but also our ability as a country to create and have made in America these types of these assets and goods and services. So I agree with that 100%, but it also, I think, lifts the veil on a problem that we have in this country, which is a dwindling industry, manufacturing. And so we have to make sure that we do that. I love that we saw, perfume companies repurposing to do hand sanitizers, and you had other companies doing similar stuff. But with the backing of the federal government and federal dollars flowing that way, I do think we would have been able to save lives and also stem the tide of this pandemic. So I fully agree with you, and I don't know why the president didn't want to do it. I presume it's because he thought it was too much government overreach, but he said that we were at war. And the last time we were at, a big global war, we deployed every single asset, including the Defense Production Act.
Well, I don't think I'm going to change your mind by anything I say based on how your question was put forward, but I'll do my best. I remember, like you do, I was just watching the news. The major subject was ventilators and that we weren't going to have enough. My understanding is we've never had a failure for anyone who needed a ventilator to have one. And the president worked with corporate America to get people to switch, including, oddly enough, Ford, to make those switches. And we literally are exporting those, never having used all of them. The president, of course, mobilized 2 large hospital ships, sent them to Los Angeles and to New York City. They were substantially not used, but they were there and available at federal expense. He also paid for the setting up of a massive amount of temporary hospitals that, again, were substantially never used. So I think that you could look at the other side of the coin and say that he did use executive authority to do quite a bit. I'm only going to take a little umbrage on this face mask for a moment. The fact is that we got mixed messages. We got told that they wouldn't do any good, that we didn't need to wear them. Literally there was, and this was coming from CDC, from 40-year career people. Those messages in the early days now have been reversed, but those messages said an awful lot. Now, N95s being used for actual or potential patients in hospitals, 3M and other organizations did gear up quickly. One of the challenges was that, as you know, this isn't just everybody's mask. Most of us are wearing masks that do not comply with the specifics of a hospital standard, and getting up and running an FDA-approved facility to those is a challenge. And so I think we could have a very technical discussion on the hospital supplies and whether they were sufficient and so on. But I think we should look at both sides of it and say, on balance, there were plenty of mistakes made, but many of them were made by the medical professionals that we rely on, who gave us certainly mixed messages. So, Ammar and I would probably say, if we could rewind, there's a dozen things that Congress and the president should have done different and sooner. And by the way, there's a couple of them that we might do differently, and they may not have made a difference. It'll be months or years before we know some of the outcomes on it. The same as when we get a vaccine, will it be like measles, substantially wiping out this disease, or will it be like the flu, and we take it every year and hope that it's 20 to 30 to 40% effective?
Yeah, if I could jump in, I think the problem is that there were mixed signals, but all of it from the administration, whether it was the CDC or the president or some other angle. So you're right, but within just the administration, that's where the mixed signals came in. And I think that the communication was lacking. I think the guidance was proper, because what they were trying to suggest is, don't take up masks that we need our essential workers and healthcare workers to have.
Ammar, you and I are going to agree to disagree on that. Because they were telling us not to take a scarf, not to take lots of masks that were available. And of course, you've been an appointee in an administration. You know the difference between a political appointee who's there on behalf of the administration and the people at the CDC that are there for decades. It was the people that were there for decades, including Fauci, that were saying things that, you can look at the video of what they said at one point, another point, and recognize that they learned on the fly, and we paid a price for those mixed messages. I'm not blaming them. They certainly didn't do it with malice or forethought, but I think for all of us, going into the next pandemic, we have to say that this pandemic, for all the decades that WHO and CDC prepared for it, they got some basic things wrong that in 1917 or 1957, we got right.
No, I agree. I just don't think that Trump is impervious to those same criticisms. I think that there's a lot of blame to go around, and certainly the CDC and the administration as a whole could have done things better. They were given a plan from the previous administration. They neglected it. And I think that timing is important. You know, if you stop the bleeding early, you are able to get rid of this later on in a quicker fashion. And it took the president and others time to get this right. And I think in hindsight, some of this had to do with more maybe politics and not just public health. And there is plenty of blame to go around. And I think the president should take responsibility for his share of the miscommunication and the calling it a hoax and et cetera. So I think we're basically saying the same thing, but assigning blame to different entities.
Sure, I could add Nancy Pelosi and
Right.
her, statements. There's plenty of blame to go around.
Sure.
I would like to ask you both what your thoughts are on the president referring to this virus as the China virus and some of the xenophobia that's come out of this, the conversation.
Well,
I'd like your thoughts on both, from both.
Well, I'm going to answer first. I take umbrage at you're calling it xenophobia. I think that the president's style, although provocative, of reminding people that this is not some virus. This is a virus that came very mysteriously and falsely stated out of China, that it was allowed to spread. Well, the WHO and China were not telling the truth early on. That could have certainly reduced the pain and suffering in China and around the world. I look at that northern area of India where Chinese citizens left to go back after the Chinese New Year and created that massive loss of life that occurred in northern Italy. You know, the Italian loss was disproportionately Chinese who work in the textile industry. And so, you know, is it diplomatic to keep calling it the Chinese virus? No, it's political, but I take umbrage at it being called per se xenophobic. This is not to say that Chinese are bad, but this did come out of China, which is a country.
It did come out of China, but the term Kung flu also came out of the president's mouth. And I think that one is clearly xenophobic, even if he was regurgitating somebody else's. The China virus, saying that, I mean, I'm not the right member of the community. I don't belong to that group to be able to tell you whether it's offensive or not. But I think if it's emanating out of China and you call it the China flu, I think in a different president's mouth who doesn't say Kung flu, maybe it would not be xenophobic. But I think in its totality, the denotation is that it has some ethnic aspect to it. And before you jump in, Darrell, let me just finish my thought, which I currently forgot. But look,
Take your time.
I think it is important that I think the president sometimes, he says things that are offensive, but then his deeds are good. Shutting down travel from China and other places was a good thing to do. New Zealand closed off their borders and they mitigated the risk. What he says is problematic. He's funded the military more than any other president in my lifetime, but then some people have these reports of him saying things that are off color. So I think a lot of folks who support Trump, and even when I find myself in alignment with him, we don't like what he says, but sometimes what he does makes more sense. And even Darrell in the 49th said that about his constituents in the 49th, that his voters sometimes don't like what the president says, but there are some people who like what he does more than what he says. And I think this whole China virus is part of that category.
Yeah, and I would just close with this because, you know, I may not change your mind, but if you look back at the story of the Spanish flu, the Hong Kong flu, we've typically named flu based on where it came out of. And so I'm not sure that calling it COVID, you know, does as much good as or bad as you might think. The reality is that, you know, I grew up in the era, you know, in which we had the Hong Kong flu. I mean, and by the way, if I remember right, it wasn't even the place it started, but it was a place it jumped to the United States from. So I think history is on the side of it's not unusual to want to insist to talk about where it came from. And in this case, since it spontaneously was produced and created in Wuhan, and investigations for decades will undoubtedly want to know more about how it spread and whether or not practices need to be changed. I think we do have to have the WHO spend time in China and not necessarily in Milan, Italy, or other places it spread to.
I think it's wrong to cross-examine whether something we say today was xenophobic based on the past. I think that's part of the problem, is that we're evolving as a culture. And in the past, we've let things go that are completely unacceptable today. But that's separate. And the CDC also, I think the president pulled out some of our officials in China that we could have had there to find this before it got worse. And I mean, obviously the WHO does its job, but we completely walked away from our responsibility. But not to beat a dead horse, just felt compelled to talk about that.
I think that's a good discussion. I'm glad that we got into it. Let me ask you about...
this is only 8 hours, right? So this is item number 1.
We have till 10 o'clock once the newscast starts.
Sounds great.
Now, question about the primary. There's an issue I want to ask individually of each of you that gave us some pause. Ammar, let me start with you. One of the things that didn't, that kind of gave us some concern was how when we asked you about 2 issues, impeachment and the Eddie Gallagher case, you kind of, it seemed like rather than answering from a place of principle, you were sticking your finger in the wind and seeing how to answer based on what people wanted to hear. And then there was, we corresponded after the interview and you tried to kind of help me explain or understand your thinking, and it confused matters more for me. So I guess my question to you is, that was 6-9 months ago, whatever it was. How do you, if a voter has that concern about you, that you're not a person of principle, but that you're trying to kind of straddle a difficult political trick here in this district, that you're not coming from a place of principle? How do you respond to that kind of question?
I think the people who know me and the district that knows me, they don't see it that way. I think my values have always been consistent. I think it's not that I didn't want to talk about it on principle. I didn't want to talk about it in hypotheticals. Impeaching a sitting president is not something that you do flippantly, nor politically. And as a candidate with no official power, all I can offer is a political response. And I don't think that's the appropriate response to something as important as a constitutional decision, a matter of national security as it was posed. And I said I wanted to have access to all the information before I made that critical decision. And Chuck Schumer was echoing that in the very last days of deliberation, and so was the House leadership, that they want to have access to SCIF and all the information before they made that decision to impeach a sitting president. It's not one I would do just based on party line. It's not one that I would do based on just partisanship. It's based on principle and not hypotheticals. And that was why I had that struggle. But even to this day, I would still need that information to make that decision. That's not one I take lightly. It's an awesome responsibility for one branch to impose itself on another branch when something that big of a claim is being made. The president's has committed impeachable offenses. So that's on that issue. And on Eddie Gallagher, I said that my hesitation about that topic, it flows from a place of deep respect for veterans and people who serve our country. And we asked them to do the inhuman. And we asked them to shed their humanity, to go do things that none of us would be able to do without the proper training. My brother's about to join the Navy as well, and I think about him and the hardships he will go through as an Arab American working in intelligence in the Navy, and the decisions he'll have to make that will keep him up at night. And I hope he always gets it right. That was my biggest struggle with that topic. But then I came back to you and I told you that the military should properly persecute and prosecute him. And then there should be oversight from civilian and the president and the administration, but there shouldn't be overriding of that decision. They should take care. They should be reprimanding people within their own rank when they break their code. So that's where I landed on it. But when I talked to you about it, it was just out of an emotional, just understanding the struggles that veterans and people who serve go through. But I do think what Eddie Gallagher did was unacceptable. And I do think that he should be reprimanded for his actions.
Darrell, let me ask you.
You want me to opine on hypotheticals? I've done it a couple of times.
No, let me ask you again about your advertising about DeMaio and the ad that many, including us, saw as gay baiting when you mentioned DeMaio's sexuality in a couple ads in your advertisement. Even the chairman of the county Republican Party said it was highly inappropriate. Do you regret that ad? At the time when you were asked about it, you actually doubled down and defended the advertisement, but now that that is months behind you, how do you view that, that incident?
You know, anytime you do something and you fail to get the message you were trying to get, you made a mistake. Anytime it causes hurt or sends a message that was just nothing to do with what you wanted to do, it's a mistake. You know, I certainly have learned from that mistake, learned that that in fact, personally looking at these kinds of ads before they go up, you know, we had hundreds of examples of my opponent having different positions in its previous races. And quite candidly, we could have and should have looked more carefully for something that wouldn't have sent a mixed message, wouldn't have caused, you know, hurt and taken us off message. So was it a mistake that I've learned from? Absolutely. Does it reflect who I am or anything about my record on not just willingness, but a long history of speaking before the log cabin Republicans, of having employees who were gay Republicans, who were staff, who were in my personal office. So, you know, having been to the funeral of my, of the significant other, not they weren't married, but a significant other of my CFO some years ago, you know, that's not who I am. And so, you know, do I regret that that's how I'm looked at? Of course. Is it a mistake I've learned from? Absolutely.
Why didn't you say that in real time when people ask those questions in the moment?
You know, when your people are all sitting around and you're saying, look, these are actual ads. This is, you know, we didn't do anything wrong. That's an easy first reaction. And I think reflection of technically correct. These were published. You know, candidly, the Union-Tribune had used that particular word about Carl in their own articles time and time again, but that doesn't make it change how it was being interpreted. You know, do I think that my party chairman was picking sides and that his speaking up was as much tipping the scales? Yeah. But having said that, leaving Tony out of it, leaving anything else out of it, this was a learning experience for me. And, you know, when you're my age and you've been in politics a long time, you know, you don't normally make these kinds of mistakes. And, you know, this was a colossal mistake. It took us off message. It changed the trajectory of what we were doing. And I spent a lot of time with gay Republicans that have supported me over the years. And some of them thought it was nothing. Others, I know it caused real deep hurt. And, you know, it depended on whether they thought I had done it out of malice or not. But not doing it out of malice doesn't change the fact that if you've been around as long as I've been around, you know that there's a difference between saying someone has told a lie and calling somebody a liar. And if you can't learn that in this business, if you will, you need to get out of it. And, you know, I thought had learned to say somebody was saying something that wasn't true, or without, in fact, ever making it personal about them. And in this case, I failed to do that.
Let me ask you both.
By the way, if I could do this very quickly, I wasn't ambiguous about Eddie Gallagher. And I think there's an important point here, and Ammar has missed it. The commander-in-chief is in fact his boss's boss's boss. And at the end of the day, just as when Jimmy Carter made a decision to pardon all the draft dodgers of the Vietnam War for the greater good of the country and for what he viewed as restoring, if you will, military order, you know, presidents make decisions. And as someone who served in the Army, both as an enlisted man, as an officer, I felt very strongly that once they discovered that Eddie Gallagher had been mistreated, that there was wrongdoing, that JAG officers were relieved for their wrongdoing, and then to find that the fundamental, most heinous charges were all untrue, changes a great deal. And so Notwithstanding, he had no right to take that picture. It was in violation of standing orders, and it did hurt the image of the military. You know, it certainly would diminish any kind of a claim that he needed to be reduced in rank or in other way formally reprimanded. And I think the president made a decision, and it was a hard one, and certainly not supported by some members of the Navy staff. But I look very strongly at that, and we ultimately asked that. We asked presidents to weigh in on somebody that didn't get a Medal of Honor. We asked presidents to make pardons and clemency to bring our country back together. And so, you know, I hope you will understand my weighing in, but, you know, in my years of service, I've certainly seen wrongdoing that needed to be investigated and things done, but I've also seen injustice that needed to be fixed by higher ranking people. And sometimes it doesn't get fixed by colonels and generals, and it does have to be fixed by the civilians who our Constitution says oversee the military.
Is there a difference though between pardoning draft dodgers and getting involved in a military decision-making process that has centuries of precedent and is kind of founded on trust in your superior? I understand what you're saying with the commander-in-chief being where the buck stops, but our editorial board agreed with many military members, which was, in this case, he went too far, and he should not have.
Well, the president had limited remedies, and he used one of them. Could he have used a different remedy? Perhaps. But, you know, looking at the Eddie Gallagher situation, at the end of the day, he did two things wrong. One, he took that picture. Two, he lost the faith of many of the men who served with him. And we could have a discussion about whether or not he should be redeployed, promoted, etc. In other words, was he a good leader? But being a good leader doesn't affect whether or not you retire at rank. And the punishment for, if you will, for his offense, which was taking a picture, which was very inappropriate, and we had standing orders against it. The punishment was not reduction in rank, taking away of his standing as a SEAL, and denying him his 20-year retirement. And so there definitely was a difference between what the Navy wanted to do and what was consistent with the kinds of punishments that others had received for similar wrongdoing. I was there on the investigation of Abu Ghraib. I saw the pictures that were taken at Abu Ghraib. We went after the people who took those pictures, and in fact, we made sure that they were disciplined. But you know, the discipline has to fit the crime, and especially when he had already been incarcerated for the crimes he did not commit. The president had a decision. Again, I'm not here to defend the president, but I am here to defend the fact that the commander-in-chief is the president of the United States, and the Secretary of Defense beneath him in the chain of command. And no officer, no matter how ranking, outranks the Secretary and then the President. That's just the way our Constitution is. And if you look at Abraham Lincoln, I just happen to have behind me, in World War II, he was actively commanding his generals. He was actively hiring and firing them. It is sometimes what happens. So this is digressing a little bit, but if you go to Washington and you're a member of Congress and you're investigating wrongdoing, and somebody says, step aside, you're interfering with the command structure, you step aside while the command structure does its job, but then you re-engage to make sure that the command structure is properly scrutinized. And if not, then you recommend remedies. And that's not unheard of. The first investigation by Congress was ordered by George Washington because he didn't trust the negative part of a battle and felt that his generals and others had done wrong. And so he asked members of Congress to investigate. These are things that you spend a lot of time as a member of Congress trying to balance what your responsibilities are, but also balance that the executive has great power in our system. And even if we disagree with his decisions, which everyone's entitled to it. I'm not standing here to agree with every decision of this president, but agreeing with the right of the president. And Matt, you know, I lived through all those draft dodgers getting to come home while others came home in body bags. It was a big decision. It looks smaller in retrospect, but at the time it was much more controversial to the men and women who had served and were serving at that time.
And I appreciate that. Let me shift gears a little bit and ask, one of the fundamental differences between the two of you is your age, right? And your experience.
Issa does not like to be reminded of that. Be gentle.
So Darrell, you're 66. You obviously were in Congress for 18 years. Ammar, you're 31. You've been in Congress for 0 years.
Yeah.
So it seems like this kind of cuts both ways. As a voter looking at this in a district that has had one family represented for decades, how should they view your agent? And Darrell, why don't you go first?
Well, you know, I've seen Duncan L. Hunter recently, and you know, if he had served another 8 or 10 years, the people of East County and the 50th Congressional will probably be a lot happier. So, you know, somebody like Duncan Hunter Sr. can serve a very long time and do a great job. My first trip to Afghanistan was with Duncan L. Hunter when he was the #2 on the Armed Services Committee, because his seniority had allowed him and his tenacity to rise to that level. And he then became the chairman of that committee. And he helped navigate us through some very difficult times in this long war. And so, you know, longevity, experience, and the seniority that allows you to be at the top of the dais has value. Now, it's not the only value. If I look old and tired and unable to go back there with zeal, then the voters need to consider that. But if my experience and track record of being consistent, conservative, and effective counts for something, then a few more terms of my doing this would benefit the people of the 50th Congressional District, and candidly, for the people of the United States and for this region, because there's a lot of very new people, including here in San Diego, where perhaps the Juan Vargases and the Scott Peters and the Darrell Issas give some continuity of effectiveness for the region.
Ammar?
Yeah, I don't think a prerequisite to being a congressman is having been a congressman. That would become a problem very quickly. But look, I think the fact that I'm from this district, I was born in East County. I think about the people that I represent, the working class, like my mom, who worked and raised me on her own through being broke and brokenhearted. My stepfather, Maurice Luque, that name may ring a bell, retired from the fire department as a spokesman. Has lived in Hamul for decades, and I've been with him for about 12 years, except for my stint when I lived in DC for a while. I think my local roots, my connection to the community, willing to work hard, I think that's important to people. And it's not just about your record, but it's also about your reputation. And they know me as somebody who's been in the community. For the past 3 days, I had to evacuate from my home 3 days ago and take my stepfather to Bonita because he couldn't handle the heat. He just went through some surgery and we had the electricity turned off. And then I went straight into the community, helping people, going to Steel Canyon High School and helping people there, asking them, what can I do as just a citizen? And there are folks who said that they lost their livestock and they have a few horses left. Can I go get them some alfalfa hay to feed their livestock? And I did that. I'm the kind of guy that will just show up and be there for people. And frankly, the times have changed. To the right of Abraham Lincoln is Reagan in the background, and his old adage was, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? I would ask the question, but change it to 18 years ago. And I think that structures change, things change. We're in different times, post-Trump even, the world's changed. And I think we need new, fresh faces to take on old problems and build on the work that, frankly, Congressman Issa worked on. You know, still sitting there in the wings is his 2013 immigration bill that I actually agreed with. But he's distanced himself from it. Obviously, he's not in Congress, so he can't continue that work right now. But my pledge is to continue the work of some people like Darrell Issa. You know, when he was gone, we got the funding for the sewage, but he had been working on that before. My goal will be, when I'm in office, if there are things that he and I agreed on, and there's a host of things, I will continue that work, not for 2 terms, but for a while. And that's what I offer is another maybe 10 or 12 years of someone who's willing to really put their shoulder on the wheel and do this work. And what I would recommend also is, Issa, when he goes to Congress, has seniority, but he'll be in the minority. And I don't think the Republicans are going to
bet on that.
No, well, I think you are, because you'd be running the 49th if you thought we'd take back the House, right? That's one of the seats that we need for the Republicans to take back the House. The reason you're running here is because you know that the 49th is unwinnable and the House is going to stay in Democratic hands. So I'll be in the majority. And you know that in the majority, you could bring home the bacon a lot better than even if you've been there for 18 years. So that's what I'll be able to do with Scott Peters and Juan Vargas and Susan Davis, or whoever replaces her, and Mike Levin, all of whom, by the way, have endorsed me and are ready to work with me on day one without any reluctance at all.
Related to
I just want to, Matt, I just want to briefly, just on one small part of what was just said, because it's been said repeatedly. I haven't walked away from any of my immigration reform proposals, including the one that Ammar is referring to. Getting to comprehensive immigration reform, we can argue about pathway to citizenship, but my proposal then and now that we come up with comprehensive guest worker programs that allow us to stabilize an illegal force in the form of a legal force. I'm not walking away from that. I'm not walking away from Scott Peters and I had an H-1B reform that he was my co-sponsor of that I left, and he didn't reoffer it last Congress, but I think very strongly the high-tech community needs to have something where those H-1Bs go to the real needed high-tech and not to the Indian consulting firms that have been dominating those slots. So any of these issues, the one thing I won't do is change my views without a change in the facts. And the facts of immigration problems haven't changed, and the solutions, although you can continue to modernize them, the solutions are substantially the same as they were a number of years ago, and I stand by them.
I just want to understand for my clarity, sir, so the
30 seconds, Ammar, 30 seconds.
So the bill that you introduced, Congressman, that gave 11 million undocumented immigrants status, semi-amnesty, I think was what was said, but 11 million undocumented immigrants status today, if you were in Congress, if by the grace of God you beat me, you would reintroduce that bill, not one that you co-supported, but that you authored yourself. You would.
Well, no, I actually authored both of the bills I was talking about. But the bill which would have said if you are employed, your employer will vouch for you, pay you legally. If you have no other criminal disqualifications, your ability to get a temporary continuation of that job with a period of time then for the American people through the Department of Labor and others to evaluate whether or not those jobs needed to be filled by somebody that had been undocumented, or whether or not there were Americans that would have taken them had that person not been there. That form of a conversion, which particularly for agriculture, would have allowed us to stabilize our workforce without some sort of amnesty. Now, there's no amnesty involved in converting somebody to an opportunity for a necessary guest worker program. And I reiterate guest worker, because not all these jobs that people have illegally would in fact qualify. And in some cases, we would eliminate those slots and the people would be forced to go home. But for many of those slots, particularly agriculture is a good example, there is very little doubt but that we would have a multi-million person continued need for them. And that's something you can hear when you go to Imperial County or you go to Riverside or you go anywhere in California, and I've been doing that for a long time. As a matter of fact, I've been a resident of the 50th and a manufacturer and a builder in the 50th since 2 years before you were born. So sometimes being older has an advantage, which is my roots here are at least 2 years deeper than yours.
Right. It's my bad that God didn't put me on this earth sooner, but your quote says it's halfway between amnesty and simply rejecting people. And it sounds a little bit more to the left than what you're saying today, but I would take on that cause, but maybe it's just the jargon. Anyways, I've taken up a lot of
Let me ask you about that, because one of the questions that some of our readers and others have had is how long you've lived in the district. Mm-hmm. So to clarify, Ammar, you were born in the district, you've lived in the district how many years? I'm sorry, you were born in the district. You came to the district at a fairly.
No, I was born in East County. At that time, that hospital was part of the district. Sometimes the districts change. and
Correct.
people don't move places. And Issa could tell you a little bit about that, because a third of the district was the 50th or his district in the past, but I didn't move, the district moved. And then, as a lot of working families do in San Diego County, out of cost and affordability, my mom and I had to move a lot. We lived in Bonita for a while. We lived in El Cajon for a while. We lived in East Lake for a while, and I went to East Lake High School there, which a small slither is still part of the 50th today. And I've had El Cajon as my residence for the past 12 years. I lived in DC for 4 years of that. But I've made East County, it's been my home from my birth, and we've moved around a little bit, but it's been the place I've known the most outside of maybe DC for those 4 years and the Middle East for 2 years.
And Darrell, walk us through your
Sure.
residency history in the district.
Yeah, I came back here to California in '85, began in San Marcos, and then eventually bought a house in Vista, and then a second house in Vista. As Ammar said, this district was the 49th district and the 48th for a period of time, or major portions of it. Places like Bonsall, Valley Center, Ramona, certainly Temecula. As a matter of fact, I represented all the way up to Paris. Never lived in that Paris or the other Paris, but you know, 15 years ago, I bought a house in Bonsall. The house in Bonsall I bought for my mother, and it was in the 49th until redistricting. Then it became, you know, part of the 50th. And when I decided that I was going to run for this office, I moved my registration, and I literally moved to Bonsall. It seemed to make sense. Now, I've got to be honest, my mom is there, she's 88, and at the current time, I'm staying elsewhere. I'm not staying in Vista, and I'm not staying in Bonsall, but I'm staying with some distance from my mom, who's 88 and a cancer survivor. And so I don't make any bones about it. I own the house. It is a residence. I made it my primary residence so that I would make the people of the district understand my commitment. But candidly, if I were at my old headquarters of the 49th, the district office, and I got on the road and started walking, in about 7 or 8 minutes, I'd be in the 50th Congressional District, because even with redistricting, it's only a matter of like 2 miles. So the gerrymandering that created a district that doesn't touch the Mexican border, but goes along it for more than 60 miles, that winds north around around Poway, and then goes up to Temecula. Just like Ammar said, you know, he wasn't born in what is currently the 50th. He has often not lived in what was currently the 50th. He currently lives in the 50th. If the voters want to have a discussion about residency from a technical standpoint, great. If they want to have a talk about commitment, I've made a commitment to this region since I moved back here, having been stationed here in California. I moved back here in '85, and I grew a family and grew a business here for all those years. And I've stayed committed to the here, and I've voted in every election since 1985.
I think the distinction for me, Matt, and everybody else asking, is I didn't change districts and maybe move my residence to run for Congress. I had been from Hamul for 12 years, and that's because my stepfather's from Hamul. He's had that home from before in the 70s, when it probably wasn't in the 50th, there probably wasn't a 50th. And in the 70s, that home caught fire from a fire similar to the one we're facing today. So the roots are not just geographical or because of redistricting. Our roots in East County go long and deep on my stepfather's side and my mother's side and my side. I went to Grossmont Community College in addition to Southwestern College, and I went to San Diego State, which is out in the district, but a lot of folks go to school there. So my roots, I don't question them. And if you want to ask folks who live in Hamul, you could ask them, but I don't believe that politicians should pick their voters. I think voters should pick their politicians. And I've been running for Congress for 4 years here, for a 2-year term to start with. And I did not try to go work with Trump first, and then that didn't work out for me. And, you know, although I probably would have worked with Kushner if he wanted me to work on Middle Eastern affairs, but I chose this district, I chose this community because it's where I come from, and it's where a lot of my life has been in terms of the community outside of just the redistricting, but East County and this part of the district has been my home. And I'll put up the people in East County against anybody in the district any day. And they had a hand in making me, for better or worse. So I'm proud of my roots, and I'll you know, stand up for my roots and prove that I'm more East County than anybody here. If they need it, we'll go shooting, we'll go skeet shooting, we'll go ATV driving, horse riding, whatever you want to see. You could watch me sleep at night in Humboldt if you guys want, but that's just where I'm from. And my community investment and rootedness goes long, long, long before deciding to run for Congress 2 years ago. And that's the distinction between the two of us, I think.
Let me ask you both about the fires has come up a couple times. I want to ask about how you reacted on social media over the weekend. Darrell, I saw you had a post that shared some of the evacuation locations and said if anyone had questions to call 911. Ammar had a post that said he had, I forget if this was before or after you had been evacuated, maybe after, but that if anyone had questions that they could call your cell phone, I believe is the number that you shared. So what should voters read in? That's one social media post on the first day of what's turning into a major, major fire. But what should voters expect from you, you know, when the unexpected happens? And Darrell, why don't you go first?
Well, first of all, if you have an emergency, 911 is appropriate, which is different than where the evacuation points and so on were. I made multiple appearances in the area. I was all the way out in Alpine multiple times, went and looked at the facilities, tried to stay out of the way of the Red Cross and others. I was on the phone both to people in Washington who stand ready to help, but I was also on the phone with the county administrator, with Diane Jacob, with others. And you know, I recognize that I'm not the congressman, and so keeping a certain amount of distance while trying to be informed and helpful is what I thought was appropriate. And championing the work that these 600 or so firefighters, both on the air and the ground, are doing seems to be the right thing to do. So when I was a member of Congress, of course I took an even more active role, without a doubt. And you know, we had a lot of fires in my district, especially out in the part that Ammar seems to forget, which is North County, where 2/3 of the district is, on and off reservations and federal land. So I've been through there. I've had the briefings. I've gone out with them, and I've helped bring the federal resources. Some years ago, we had a major fire, and we discovered that the helicopters at Camp Pendleton were sitting idle because Cal Fire wouldn't use them because, quote, they didn't meet their standards. And it took a lot of work by then Duncan Hunter Sr. and myself and others to push and say, this is ridiculous. Get them zones and stop playing the politics of your contractors versus ours. And so those kinds of things I've got a long and active record of. In this particular fire situation, you've got to be aware that there are good people doing the job, and you know, Ammar and I should do what we can do, but also stay a little bit out of the way of people doing it. And I think that's what we've both done.
Ammar?
Yeah, just to be clear, I didn't say either call the authorities or me. It was both and in my case. It wasn't just saying, call me, I'll be the guy in charge. I didn't do that. But I as an East County member, my thing was we take care of our own, we take care of each other. This isn't our first fire, and it sadly won't be our last. And we got to take care of for each other. So I went to the Steel Canyon High School and asked folks, hey, with my hands open, how can I help? I know we're right here at the Red Cross. What do you need? And the guy said, hey, can you go to the feeder store down the street? I don't have any money. I lost a lot of my belongings. His name was Tom. He actually was covered by CBS afterwards, and he lost almost everything. And he asked me, can you get me some feeder? So I went some food, and I did that for his pets. You know, I went to the fire and I looked at it over there. I extended my hands and told people, how do you want to help? And the beauty of East County is every person who called me did not ask for help. They offered to help. They just didn't want their number put out there. And that's who we are in East County. We're very misunderstood. We're not ignorant, we're ignored, and we are forgotten by the rest of San Diego proper. And we've had to lean on each other as a result for many years, decades. So I just simply put out my number because that's what we do in East County. It brings out the best in us, hardships, because we lean on each other. And I've been telling people to go to 211 and 911 and the Humane Society and CAL FIRE and all that stuff to keep themselves updated. But I went the extra level of being involved with the constituents, and the way that I campaign will be how I legislate. And I think the way we campaign is a reflection on how involved and the access that people will have to us. That's a reflection of how we're campaigning will be how we legislate.
I know the board has a lot of policy questions, so let me just kick off that part of the conversation with a segue here. What role in Congress would you play to fighting climate change, and in particular to working to prevent or minimize these fires that are now just kind of a reality every year? Darrell, why don't you go first?
Well, one of the challenges we face is California's reluctance to do the kind of clearing of combustible material they should do. But as a federal officer, I've certainly led and pushed to make sure that the resources are made available, both to clear on federal and state lands, and the resources to quickly put out fires, including when we modernize for the C-130Js and the like. Having said that, you went to the climate change question. The challenge in climate change that I've worked on, and I was a member of a caucus that put aside the idea that there's only one solution and that man has to stop using carbon, but rather said, what are the solutions we can have? And that's a bipartisan caucus that was formed based on the idea that we would always be equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats, no matter who was in charge, that we wouldn't have some like a chair versus a non-chair, and that we would look for opportunities. And, there are opportunities. Today, one of the challenges in California is by shutting down all our nuclear facilities, by not allowing hydroelectric, either active hydroelectric or pump storage to be produced, we have no choice but to either have power outages in the evenings or add to natural gas resources, which we've been reluctant to do. And so we're constantly being told, cut your power, but on a 100-degree day, the power that they want you to save is in fact your air conditioning. So your choice is to swelter in air conditioning without air conditioning or have blackouts. And this sort of a lose-lose situation, we need to stop doing it. We need to have the maximum amount of renewables that we can have, but we need to have reliable power. And I worked, when I represented Paris and Lake Elsinore, on trying to promote a large pump storage station. This allows us to take renewable during the day, wind and solar, pump it up, and then recover it at night. It's much less invasive of our environment than batteries would be. And by the way, it's the equivalent of hundreds of acres of batteries if you could even do it. These kinds of solutions that would allow us to continue having more renewables, but have them also be available when we need them, which is between 4 and 8 or 9 at night. These solutions have to be pushed for. I was an advocate and continue to be an advocate that we not abandon artificially nuclear, because it is our shortest distance to zero net emissions of CO2. And I held hearings as a member of Congress on a number of alternate ideas about climate change, so that people would be looking and saying, what are all the elements of a sustainable ecology? Can we get the ocean to absorb more CO2, which it's the largest taker or sequestration. The largest form of it comes actually from the ocean, having algae fall to the bottom. Can we increase that amount so that we'd end up with a net zero? So without having the main fight on CO2 being, well, we just have to stop and sign these treaties, and instead say, what can we do for this? And by the way, the other part of it is, because it has been warmer when there was no man on Earth than it is now, we also know that even if man had no input, we still have to be prepared for a world that we can live in where it might be hotter or colder than it is today. And that's another part of what the federal government needs to not just research, but help make sure that those solutions are available. So all of those are big solutions, and the federal government does invest a lot in science. We need to invest more in the science that will help us cope with climate change if it were natural, and with mitigating if we can in fact mitigate if CO2 is the culprit. So I'm not changing positions. These are the positions I had when I was in a safe Republican seat, and these continue to be the positions I had when I wasn't even running for Congress. A lot of people make this thing, well, Issa turned to the left after 2016. I was leaving to go to the administration, and they often say, well, Issa, you know, he got into this caucus. Well, when that caucus was formed, I knew I was going to the administration, and I still joined it because I thought it was worthwhile, as did Scott Peters and other people who were in safe districts. It's not about safe district, not safe district. It's about trying to find solutions whenever you can.
Ammar?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a whole host of things we need to do, but I've always been consistent on my belief that we have to reduce our carbon footprint and try to create jobs in the process. And I think we can do that. I think that renewable energy, once it scales and we're able to store it properly, which is a problem that we face in California, and I face personally, we have to evacuate from our home in Humboldt. We're finding out now it's because of the fire, but I'm a little bit skeptical about that, if I'll be honest, with SDG&E. I do think that we have some energy policies in California that I think need to be really examined on in terms of supply versus need. But on a federal level, I would, when it comes to combating the fires, I would stand tall against President Trump and not let him threaten to take away funding for CAL FIRE and our fire crews, which has happened multiple times. And I will stand tall against him for that. And I think after this fire is over, this one in particular, we should do an after action report, and it should be public on what we did right, what we could have done better, how we could have prepared the public better, how we could have activated these federal resources sooner, from the governor on down, how we could have deployed our military sooner, possibly, how we could have, you know, activated the U.S. Forest Service sooner. So how can we deploy our federal resources sooner? So that, because I believe when it comes to responses, emergency responses, whether it's fire or pandemic or war, timing is everything. And I think I'd like to look at the timing of how we responded and coordinated resources for the fire. On climate, look, I don't take my cues from you don't have to take your cues from AOC or anybody else. Ask the military. Last year, they put a report out on the changing climate affecting their military preparedness. 2/3 of all major mission critical military bases on mainland US soil are not fully combat ready because of hurricanes and mudslides, and of course, as we know too well, fires and rising coastlines. And while it's a competitive selection of national security threats we face in this world, from ISIS and decentralized terrorism and Iran and everything else, they say that climate change is the biggest national security threat that we face. So we should have a World War II mobilization to combat it, I think. And I think that's something that makes a lot of sense. And the most in-demand job today is solar panel technician. The most in-demand second job in this country today is wind turbine technician, and we have a skills gap. So if we did invest in trying to turn this big mother of all of our problems, the mother of all of our solutions, and create jobs and usher us into the 21st century, it's good economics, and it's also good for our environment. And if you don't believe in climate change, let's say you supported ClimateGate back in the day, that's fine. Let's just assume that climate change isn't real. What would be wrong with making sure that America seeded the future of energy? That we didn't have China and Germany, who aren't debating climate change, run laps around us and seed the most important commodity in this world, energy, to another country. We should be on the front lines making sure that America outbuilds, outgenerates, and outcompetes the rest of the world. So even if you don't believe in climate change, the actions to combat it are good for America's economy.
Let me open it up to the board for other questions on other issues.
The Congressional Budget Office 2 years ago put out a report that said the United States is on track to have its entire debt payments paid for with borrowed money. That's like the equivalent of having a family taking out credit cards to pay interest on their old credit cards. This is completely unsustainable. No nation in the history of Earth has ever consistently spent 30 or 40% more than it's taken in. And yet neither party seems serious about this. How would you guys address the debt crisis that's only gotten worse because of COVID-19 relief.
You want to take it first, or should I go?
I'll take it first. Look, you're preaching to the choir. As we've reduced as a percentage of GDP and as a percentage of the budget, defense, we've increased our social welfare spending, and we've done so in a way in which it is more and more funded with general tax revenue and less funded with the actual FICA and so on. And that's allowed administration after administration to ignore Social Security reform, Medicare reform, Medicaid reform, and any and all of the other cost drivers. So do we have to look at all of them? Yes. Is it the fifth rail or third rail? Is it an area where as soon as you get into specifics, you get bashed? Absolutely. Have I ever been unwilling to say that they have to be addressed? No, I haven't been. You know, I'm acutely aware that if you look at our constitutional responsibilities, less than a third of what we spend in Washington falls within our direct constitutional responsibilities. Even if you include the post office's $8 billion a year loss, the fact is you don't get past about $1 trillion on what is purely federal, and then you get into all the entitlements. And so real entitlement reform as part of real tax reform has to happen. And you know, I'd be the first to say that there was a reason that my predecessor was an appropriator, and I specifically, when I ran for office, said, I don't ever want to be an appropriator. I don't want to be the guy who's always telling you that we can't live without more money, because that's what I saw appropriators do as an outsider, and that's what I've seen them do as an insider. I brought up defense because I have seen in constant dollars defense go down. Even under this president, in constant dollars, the federal spending on the military is smaller than it was when Bill Clinton left office. So it's important to know that you can't just say, well, if we stop spending money on the military, it'd all be okay. We could stop spending completely on the military, disband them, and you'd still have a deficit. That's how bad it is.
All right, so that's a good question. So look, a couple things. I do think that there's a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse in the federal government. I worked at the Department of Labor, and there were 5,000 people in that building. And I would see guys that would just be up there for like 4-hour lunches. And I'm like, what are you doing? Like, why are you even here if you're not working? So there is a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse. I've seen it up close and personal, and we need to reduce that. I think that our federal government, even our local governments, are operating in the 60s, right? And right now we're in 2020. So I think we need to bring them onto the 21st century, automate a lot of our work that we do that will reduce costs across different agencies. We see that the military doing it with DARPA. That explains why some of the costs have gone down, because it's streamlined like other agencies should be, and we should continue to do that to lower the cost of our federal spending. And if we're not going to lower the cost of our federal spending, we need to figure out then how are we going to figure out to increase spending? And I think freeing up money from the federal government with these agencies and reducing the fraud, waste, and abuse and having automation is one thing. The second thing is, you know, under Reagan, who's behind Issa's shoulder, I think tax loopholes for the well-off and well-connected were $800 billion. Today it's $1.6 trillion. And the corporate tax rate was 35%, now it's down to 21%, and effectively it's 11%. And a quarter of Fortune 500s paid no corporate tax. They paid other taxes, but not corporate taxes. So we have a system where we reward work less than wealth, and the well-off and well-connected are not paying what even is on the books because they find these deductions and loopholes and everything else. And it's far exceeds even what Reagan envisioned. So if we're going to continue to have a big federal budget and a big military, we need to make sure that we're funding it properly. And I think the more people, working people, that you could take from welfare to workforce, you do two things. You reduce the cost of entitlements, but you increase people's paying of taxes. So I'm a big believer in transforming some of our welfare programs into workforce programs. The Department of Labor, we did a lot of that, and it was really effective, and I want to continue to do that. And that's why I support investing in renewable energy, because I think that's the way that we do it. And also transform our caregiving economy as well, right? I think this pandemic has shown us that we need people to care for the youngest among us, the eldest among us, and those who have disabilities. and make sure to pay them properly. So if we do that, get more people working, paying taxes, we have more of a federal budget, more revenue, and we don't have to keep borrowing money. Those are some of the things I would do, and tax reform that I discussed. So those are some of the things that I would do. And my concern about this is I don't want my generation to be the first one left off worse than our parents. And we might not get Social Security or Medicare, or, you know, some people's big ideas to save Social Security is they're going to tell me to live longer, basically, and wait for Social Security to happen. When I'm 66 and I have 18 years under my belt in Congress, like the congressman, I won't get to have Social Security or Medicare, because the big idea is live it until you're 72, then you get Medicare and Social Security, which is an earned benefit. So I want to make sure that those programs are solvent for my generation and my kids' generation. And also, I know for a fact that my generation is paying it back to the congressman's generation, my mother's generation. So I want to make sure that my generation is working and employed and creating businesses, paying taxes to pay it back to when my mother decides to retire, or the congressman chooses to retire after I win this election. So
I wish we had more time, because there's a bunch of questions that I was hoping to ask you both, but I know we're going to run out of time. So I'd just like to know if you could each briefly respond to whether or not you think the current U.S. Asylum system, the way it's set up right now, is working in this country.
I'd give a quick answer. I don't think so. I think we need more judges to adjudicate these matters quicker. I think we're a nation of immigrants, and we've always have been, unless you're the descendants of slaves or Native Americans. So we have to continue to be America. The symbol of America is the Statue of Liberty, not a barbed wire fence. And those seeking asylum legally should be allowed to bring their dreams, their hopes to our country, to our shores. I mean, you look at the CBO said that immigration reform would pump a lot of money into our economy. Giving dreamers alone, this is a different topic, but on the immigrant issue, giving dreamers citizenship would give us $480 billion more dollars in the next 10 years. That means in 1 year, it would for half a year, they would pay for Trump's wall, right? In terms of the cost. So, and that would help us reduce our deficits as well. So I think bringing these asylum seekers, bringing immigrants into our economy and way of life would be good for our economy. But you know what? They're not just a dollar sign. These people are humans, and they have intrinsic value regardless of whether they contribute to our economy or not. They just so happen to work harder than a lot of people. And I could attest to that with my family, and Issa, as a descendant of immigrants himself, could attest to the fact that immigrants make America more American, and that's my policy would reflect that reality.
And I don't want to confuse pro-immigration of most of the 1.2 million or so that will legally immigrate to the U.S. every year. I think we set that in one camp where we can always reallocate or move around or increase or decrease those numbers. And I've never proposed decreasing them. But when we look at asylum has some real problems. The majority, undeniably, of people who request asylum are not meritorious after they're adjudicated. They, in fact, are really economically wanting to come here, sometimes fraudulently applying. But at the end of the day, they're turned down in vast numbers. And this backs up and clogs the system. Ammar and I would both, I'm sure, point to our Chaldean community, Iraqi Christians, persecuted in their home country, forced to flee, or a host of other, particularly Arab Christians, who find themselves in untenable situations in the Middle East. Or for that matter, a generation ago, the many Iranian Jews who, after the fall of the Shah, found themselves having to flee if they could, many of them having to escape in the middle of the night. And so legitimate asylum rules with a recognition that we'll always be going to have people who want to come here and use asylum as an attempt to circumvent what is in fact regular routine immigration for those who want to come here simply because they want to come here for a better life. You know, I've always said that we could set any number between 1 million and hundreds of millions, and we still would have more people feeling that they couldn't get enough to come here. And we have a number of programs that are backed up because they have allocations of slots, sibling reunification, parent reunification, and so on. And many of them are, in fact, chain migration. And chain migration is a derogatory term, but let's just put it in perspective. If we look at everyone who wants to come and we first ask them, do you want to come for economic reasons? If so, here's line A. Do you need to come here because if you stay where you are, you will be killed or persecuted? That's a separate line. I think that separate line has to be, and Ammar said it well, we need to have enough judges to quickly adjudicate it so that we can separate those who need to be brought in, that they not be forced to wait in Mexico or the like, because if they're living in peril, we need to adjudicate them reasonably and not play any politics with it. On the other side, there's plenty of room for immigration reform that more fairly allocates those who aspire to come here, being able to come here, not based on whether or not, they have some hedge or edge based on where they are, but whether or not we're fairly allocating it. And I think the debate has gone on, and as you know, has gone on, and it's changed several times during our history. But that's something that eventually we will do on a bipartisan basis. I am concerned that two presidents have used this as part of their politics. The last one was President Obama near the end of his administration, ramping up these numbers much higher at the end, essentially using it as a political tool in an election. And then this president, who's found himself as the bad guy, ramping down those short-term ones and saying, no, we're going to take our share of the world's displaced people from Iraq, from Syria and the like, but we're not going to simply open the floodgates. And I would wish that we wouldn't play politics with those kinds of things, that we would be more formulary so that no president would artificially increase it and no president would find himself decreasing it fairly or unfairly.
I have a question about the Black Lives Matter movement. What are your thoughts on it, and what do you think the federal response should be?
Well, I think we certainly are looking at a corporation that takes in a lot of money. And I think I'd like to set that group aside and look instead at the causes of and the injustice has been observed. You happen to have two Arab Americans here, so the expression, driving while Black or flying while Arab, we've heard it, and we recognize that that we've got to make sure that that may be humorous at times, but it's got to not be true any longer. If you're an African American and it's going to make you disproportionately stopped and checked, that's wrong. And we need to find ways to prevent that. And we certainly need to make sure that our police forces reflect their community and respect their community. And all of that is part of what the movement, separate from the corporation, has every right to expect people to do in Washington, in Sacramento, and in every city hall. The challenge we have is mixed in with that movement are, without a doubt, a lot of people who are committing crimes and violence, who are harassing people when they're just trying to have a meal. They're getting in the way of their rights and demanding rights. And I saw I think it was on KUSI this morning where they were, there was somebody getting in the face of a diner without a face mask on. And it was a Black Lives Matter, you've got to do this, you've got to do this. These kinds of things are counterproductive. And I think as a society, we need to support the legitimate aspirations of all Americans and push back on people who get on the wrong side of people's civil rights.
Yeah, so look, I'm sorry I was smiling when he said the Arab comment, just because you either laugh or cry, right? In this reality, when you're Arab American, I've been called a terrorist by my former congressman, I decided to laugh it off and cry. So, but the thing is that Arab Americans or Latino Americans, which I represent, our pain is not the same as the Black community. No one took us out of our continent, for the most part, and put us here and forced us to work for free, and then never got the 40 acres and a mule, and then never, when Reconstruction happened, basically made Black people work for free as prisoners by changing the laws. And then, you know, when they went to go fight in our wars, in the beginning, the most progressive legislation ever to touch American soil, the New Deal, did not include Black people in many instances, including the GI Bill and affordable housing. So we have to atone for our original sin. And I think some of this movement is responding to that. And, you know, those kinds of ancient hatreds still exist today, not as an attitude. That's what this movement has taught us, but as a structure, as an institution that we have to change institutionally, not just say, I don't feel racist anymore, but there are structures that exist that need to be redesigned, reimagined, brought to the 21st century. And I think somebody, you know, a new generation of leadership could really play an important role in dealing with this and many other things that we've talked about today. And I think when it comes to, you know, how we deal with, you know, reimagining what to do with the police, I have a 10-point plan that's on my website and on social media that you could look at. I've actually talked to the Police Officers Association about many of them, and they actually support a lot of those ideas. And one of them is something that Senator Rand Paul co-authored, the idea of trying to update the 1033 program in the National Defense Authorization Act to not just allow the military to give surplus equipment to our police department. SWAT is different, and the reason that existed in the 90s was to deal with the drug war. But the fact that we're outfitting our police officers like they're going to war is a problem, and even police officers recognize that. Having national standards of training, having a whole bunch of things that you could go to my website. I don't want to spend too much time talking about it here, but then when it comes to, you know, the whole idea of defunding the police, that notion, I think it's problematic. One is a slogan because some people don't mean it as defunding the police. And I have to remind Democrats, what do you feel like when people say defund Planned Parenthood? Do you hear the nuance in there, or does it just scare you? That's how people feel about when you say defund the police. Or the notion of abolishing the police, like what was done in New Jersey. It's kind of a misleading thing because they still have a police department, even though they've changed the hierarchy and the leadership. So I think the notion of defunding the police is problematic because even during the civil rights movement, we have a problem of under-policing in certain areas and over-policing in certain areas. And we have to understand that it's not just a matter of funding, it's a matter of priorities. And so when it comes to funding the police, I support funding the police, making sure that we have more training, which I don't know how you do more training with less funding, but I think you need proper funding to fund training to make sure that they know about de-escalation and disengagement. And I think, you know, the more you get trained, the better off you should get paid. This is true about everything in life, right? So making sure that we're holding police officers accountable is important, but making sure that we have the best qualified people to serve and protect is also critically important. And I think having representation from different communities in the police force is a step in the right direction. But there's a whole host of things that we could be doing. The national ban on chokeholds, the making sure that you are reprimanded nationally, the misconduct. It isn't just you leave San Diego, go to Arizona and become a police officer there. If you were fired for a reason that was because you killed somebody or were too violent, you shouldn't be able to just move over and work somewhere else. I think you need to have that track record follow you. So there's a whole host of those reforms that I support. And, you know, I think when you talk to people in the community, they tell you that they want police officers to do their job, but not come after our boys and girls. And we just know the statistics. You know, if you're Black in this country, you're more likely to be stopped for the same offense as a white person. And we know that white people, there's more of them in aggregate that are, you know, on the receiving end of violence than Black people, but not by percentage. So I think it's important that we don't be cute and fast and loose with the facts and really be honest about the fact that we do have a problem of our police officers, A, resorting to violence too quickly, and B, being overextended. I've talked to police officers who say, I don't want to take care of homeless people and deal with mental health distress calls. I'm happy to escort somebody who is actually professional in that line of work and take them along with me, because that person is going to need safety too if things go bad. So I think it's important that we don't just focus on slogans, but focus on substance. And that's where I think some of these things, you know, people get lost in the shuffle. When the Black Lives Matter started in the very beginning, a lot of people didn't understand what it meant. And now in its second reiteration, it's become more disciplined, more focused, and has direct kind of demands for kind of this racial reckoning that I think is not falling on deaf ears, whether it's in politics or in industry. And I think, not to get too technical, but movements today, they're not always as mature as they were during the civil rights movement. You needed a very competent, inspiring person to create a movement back in the day. Now, the movement precedes the agenda because it could just happen on social media, and sometimes it prematurely happens. I'm happy to see that this movement, not the corporation, but the movement, I didn't even know it's a corporation, but the movement of honest people trying to peacefully protest for their rights, it has matured, and I think is not falling on deaf ears. And let me just say very pointedly, I have zero tolerance for any spin-offs or exploiting this movement for acts of violence and vandalism and killings. And I don't support that at all. And I hold that in high condemnation. And I don't think that people should be taking it upon themselves to remove statues that they might not agree with. We should have a way to decommission them, put them in museums, but that is a crime. And once peaceful protests become criminal acts, it detracts from the genuine grievances that this community has had since the inception of this country.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up on racism and training. On Friday, the president signed an executive order to bar anti-racism training at the federal government. Do you support his decision?
No.
You know, I have to sort of agree that the concept of barring rather than as the executive making sure that it's meaningful and appropriate, you know, and unfortunately, I don't understand what the bar means, and I would join with Ammar that I would hope that the sensitivity training, the training, you know, I heard one time a great recognition of what racism is. Most people think racism is hating the other race. It isn't. It's not respecting the other race as equal. It's somehow putting people as somehow less. And I think that it's pretty important that we have zero tolerance for that, and that we teach people that in fact racism has to be eliminated by that part of the I want to say Constitution, but of our Declaration of Independence. You know, all men are created equal. We've got to remember that we are all equal, that there is no difference between the worth of a man or a woman, the worth of a black or a white or an Arab or an Indian. And once you teach that, then you can have discussions about how you enforce where you have crimes or wrongdoing, regardless of some other characteristic of that person. So I would certainly say that we need to always have that. In the Army, we called it sensitivity training. And, you know, there's nobody who's not going to snicker a little bit when you say, you know, Army Tank Corps sensitivity. There's nothing very sensitive about driving a tank, but there is a sensitivity to the men and women that go in harm's way with you, and you've got to find a way to educate people. So I would certainly say that to the extent that that bar would limit that, I would not support it.
And I have something to add to it, but we don't have time, so I'll just muzzle myself for a second.
And I appreciate that. You guys have been gracious with your time. Why don't you take 2 minutes each for a closing statement? And Darrell, why don't you go first?
Sure. Look, I'm offering people experience, the ability to be a leader on day one, and to make a difference for this community. I have the energy and I have the experience. This is a district that I didn't seek when I was offered an opportunity to serve in the administration, and I chose to accept it and not run for re-election. Candidly, if I were in the administration, I suspect that when the recognition that the 50th was going to be vacated, and the recognition that I missed the work I did in Congress, it would have been a very difficult one had I been working around the world at a trade development agency, but I wasn't. I was sitting idle, extremely frustrated that the 18 years of service I had been interrupted, and that I wasn't making the difference that I enjoyed and felt was a big part of of my view of giving back. You know, I'm supported by a long list, but I'll be quick. Diane Jacob, Jim Desmond, Mike Nagar up in Temecula, Bill Wells, Kevin Faulkner, Rebecca Jones, Santee Mayor John Minto, Brian Jones, my former opponent, and of course, Carl DeMaio. Most of those names represent virtually all of the elected leaders in this district. Many of them worked with me for years. You know, Diane Jacob, for example, we worked together because our districts overlapped for all those years. She knows that, in fact, when she needed help in East County, when things needed to be done, I was there. And I didn't say there's some hypothetical line where I can't help you. And I will do the same thing for this entire state and for this region and for this country if I'm honored to be returned.
Thank you. Ammar?
Yeah, so look, I've been running for 4 years in this district. It hasn't been a fleeting passion of mine. I am very committed to this place. And I think my actions show it. And the way that I campaign it, the way I'll legislate. I've talked to many people, including Republicans who work for the county Republican Party, who say, Ammar, we have maybe 70% we agree with you on, but we have 100% of your access and attention. And we know that will serve us well if you're in Congress. And they say, we might agree with Issa 90% of the time. We have 0% of his access and attention. And so I think we will always agree on everything. I'm not trying to paint myself as the guy who's going to agree with everybody everywhere. I'm the guy who will always be there to listen, to learn. And honestly, running for 4 years in this district has made me a better candidate and hopefully made me a better congressman. I've always been someone who listens to people ever since I was young. But when you go into this space thinking about how do I serve you, you try to understand more than you want to be understood. And so I've always known the things that we face in this district, whether it's the cost of living or these fires or healthcare or the things that, you know, being unemployment being the double the rest of San Diego, the struggles that we uniquely face, not just in East County, but in North County. And I'll add that I haven't forgotten Escondido. Last cycle, we got a Democratic mayor in there with our efforts. San Marcos, we won every single precinct. And Temecula, we did a lot better than people expected. I know the whole district very well. And we helped make some change in Escondido, the 11th most conservative city in the country up until the work that we did to make it more moderate, like the candidate who almost won the district last time. And, you know, people say to me that and I take this as a compliment, you're a younger version of Issa. You remind us when Issa first started. And look, I've sat down with Issa and we've had cigars and talked. And I told him, like, I respect the fact that as an Arab American, he went where few people could go in terms of getting there. And I'm a disruptor just like he was when he began. I was an outsider like when he began. I think that DC does something to people after decades of service. I think it's not bad apples. I think the barrel is rotten and you get in there and you kind of lose yourself. I think that's what happens in DC. And that's why I support term limits. And I actually just got endorsed by the term limits organization, along with Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and others, and Tim Scott and others. So that's something that I believe in because I think you lose sight of yourself in DC when you spend that much time. And my commitment is to continue the legacy of others who've done great work in this region and be the fresh face and the independent voice who's willing to take on his party on things that hurt the district, but I'll work with anyone if it helps my district. And I think I've built the reputation in this district where even Republicans who work for the party are saying you wouldn't be the worst thing to happen to the 50th. So my hope is that people will understand that I'm not just running to win, I'm living to serve. And I really want to be someone that can make this district proud after so many years of national shame brought to this district with our previous congressman and Duke Cunningham and Jim Bates and, you know, Bob Filner, who represented a part of this district. It's finally time that we have a congressman who's beholden to the people and will take this seat back and give it back to them. And that's the kind of congressman that I hope to be. And I hope that you'll give somebody who has many years, hopefully, of service a chance to start this November.
Thank you both for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.